Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Havens. I'm the event manager here at An Unlikely Story. On behalf of the Attleboro Public Library and An Unlikely Story, we'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. We are so honored to welcome US Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Once the presentation begins, well, it has begun, and I have turned off the side chat. If you would like to ask Joy a question during the Q&A portion of the event, you can enter at any time in the Ask a Question box down below. You can also upvote a question that someone else has already asked, so then we don't have duplicate questions, and the most popular ones float to the top. If you'd like to purchase any of Joy's books, including her newest, Poet Warrior, you can click on the green button in the center bottom of your screen that says click here to buy the book. I will now turn it over to Amy Rillinger, the director of the Attleboro Public Library, to introduce Joy. Thank you so much for partnering with us on this, Amy.
Well, thank you for partnering with us. Always a pleasure. So yes, I have the great pleasure to kick off our NEA Big Read Attleboro keynote address with the author of An American Sunrise, Joy Harjo. The NEA Big Read, this is our 15th NEA Big Read. And the reason we do these events and apply for this grant each year is because the NEA's aim with this program is to broaden our understanding of the world, our community, and ourselves through the sharing of a good book. It inspires conversation and discovery, and that is exactly what we are here for tonight. This year was the first time the Big Read Organizing Committee in Attleboro was unanimous in their decision to choose one book to write the grant for. It is also the first time we've chosen a book of poetry. And I came across this wonderful quote of Joy's that says, "Don't worry about what a poem means. Do you ask about what a song means before you listen? Just listen." And I just think that that's great inspiration for all of the reading and sharing that we're going to do in the next few weeks. But you're not here to listen to me talk. You're here to listen to Joy Harjo, who was the 23rd US Poet Laureate here for us. Joy is going to be speaking to us from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she was born. Joy began writing poetry while she was a student at the University of New Mexico in response to Native American empowerment movements. She has an MFA from Iowa's Writers Workshop, and she's taught at major universities from Hawaii to Tennessee across the country. She's performed music and poetry nationally and internationally. There's 9 books of poetry, 2 memoirs, 2 children's books, and plays as well. Just a woman of many talents. And in closing, I just want to say I came across this wonderful quote that was said about Joy by poet Alicia Ostreicher when Joy was given the Wallace Stevens Award. It says, "Throughout her extraordinary career as poet, storyteller, musician, memoirist, playwright, and activist, Joy Harjo has worked to expand our American language, culture, and soul. Her visionary, justice-seeking art transitions personal and collective bitterness to beauty, fragmentation to wholeness, and trauma to healing." And if I can speak to you as a reader for a moment and not just the library director, I will tell you that Joy's work has touched me personally. There is one particular poem called Remembering that I have posted in my house where I see it every day. And if that doesn't say something about how powerful her work is, I don't know what does. So without further ado, welcome, Joy Harjo.
Thank you. Thank you so much for welcoming me into your community there in Attleboro, in one of my favorite areas in the country. I'm happy to be here on behalf of the power of poetry and the power of being a participant in the human story at this time, something we're all doing. And poetry is one of the tools to assist us on this journey. It's a journey we make together. It's also a journey that we make very singly and individually. And I was going to say, so I'll pull this together. I read a little bit, I speak, and so on. And I didn't intend to become a poet. That was not on my, career day. I don't even think we had career day coming up, but I know my kids did. There's never a table for poet. And the poetry, I came to my love of poetry through my mother, and my mother reading me poetry. And I might read a little about that journey from Poet Warrior. But she was also a songwriter. But what I came to love about poetry, I guess, was the musicality and the ability of poetry to speak what can't be spoken. At times when we have no words, poetry is always there. That's why it always shows up during pandemics. It shows up during times of great divides and broken hearts. It shows up at birth, times of birth, transformation, marriage, death, coming of age. And it's here to help take care of us. I remember when I was I started out my college education, pre-med, the minor in dance, and everyone wanted to help me with school because they could see a need for Native physicians and medical personnel. And when I changed to back to art, well, it made sense. I come from, on one line, a family of Native artists, and all in Oklahoma we had art. This is a poster by Frank LaPena, California Native artist, one of my favorite painters. Anyway, let me move this around here. So, but I didn't come in. So then when I changed my major, and I didn't intend to, I liked paint. I still love painting, and that's my plan when this Poet Laureateship ends, is to go back to painting. And of course I'll always write poetry, and I'm going to write a third memoir, etc. And I have 3 children's books that will be coming out. Is that when I said change my major to poetry, and again, I didn't plan on it, but I was around for the first time real Native poets, like in person, reading poetry that came from New Mexico, in places and with people and history that I knew, that made a huge, huge difference. So when I changed my major to poetry, it was very difficult to get money for graduate school. I got accepted into what was considered the best grad program for the MFA, I think it was the original MFA program at Iowa. And I had somebody, it's good to have mentors and people who believe in you. And Joe Sando, Hamus Pueblo, stepped up and he believed in me. And so poetry has taken me on quite a journey. For me, it was, and it still is, a door. I'm still learning. There's a lot I don't know. But what poetry gives is, it gives, you can stop for a moment and just listen. I'm going to read from Poet Warrior, actually. It kind of accompanies an American Sunrise. But I want to read you a little bit about poetry and becoming a poet. And because I know a lot of people are freaked out about poetry. Oh no, they run away from it. And yet, listen to the lyrics of a lot of songs like Hotel California. What does that mean? It's about listening. And so I'm going to read. I know I have a really good story a South African poet told me about poetry and baboons, but I better not. I better get to reading some poetry. So as much as I love poetry, and I always did love poetry, I often felt alone in my love. Being a poet was nothing anyone could aspire to be. There were no poets in our neighborhood, a community that included many Creek, Cherokee, Osage, and Seminole citizens. That didn't mean that there weren't poets in our communities or that we didn't have poets in our tribal histories. One of the most nationally well-known and well-published poets from Oklahoma, from the borderlands of the late 19th century and early 20th century, was Alexander Posey. Posey was from Eufaula, where many of my relatives lived. My Aunt Lois said we were related. I believe I remember her saying it was through her grandmother, Miley or Millie Carr, who married David Menahu. It was her family. Posey lived during a time of great change as the Muscogee Creek people transitioned through many shifts of fortune, the worst probably being the passing of the Dawes Act or Allotment Act. Anyway, he became a journalist. He was a journalist, and he wrote what's called Fuss Fixico letters about what was going on in the tribal government at that time. But then the poetry was his more personal lyrical voice. And sometimes he grappled with the same issues he confronted in his journalism. He died at age 34 by drowning, which he foretold in this poem. And I'm going to read this little poem called My Fancy by Alexander Posey. Why do trees along the river lean so far out toward the tide? Very wise men tell me why, but I am never satisfied. And so I keep my fancy still, that trees lean out to save the drowning from the clutches of the cold, remorseless wave. In the public schools I attended, and I'm speaking to you, I need to say, I'm speaking to you today from Tulsa, Oklahoma, also part of the Muscogee Creek Nation Reservation. The Osage Nations are to the north, over this way to the east, Cherokee, and I am right now called the Arts District in Tulsa, which again is part of the Creek Nation Reservation. I went to school here. I went to elementary, junior high here, and 1 year of high school. Then I went to Indian boarding school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, an arts school. Now, when I was coming up, we did have poetry. We would have the dreaded poetry unit. And I think it turned a lot of people away from poetry. A lot of the teachers you could feel their dread, and I think it scared a lot of the students off. So this is what I have to say about that. In the public schools I attended, we did not find any of Alexander Posey's poetry in our books. And I hope it's different now. There's a lot more. I remember in the 80s, a lot more, there was an awareness that, wait a minute, America and American literature is all of us. We were taught poetry in our elementary and junior high classes once a year during the dreaded poetry unit. We would be asked by teachers who were often lost when it came to poetry questions like, what did this poet from England a century ago mean when they said? Yes, what did it mean? We wondered in confused silence. Or we would be asked to scan the meter when we were unsure of accents in the stylized language of a century or two ago. Poetry, when taught this way, was an irrelevant stranger to our ears when we naturally made poetry on the playground, jumped rope to it. We were not taught how this poetry could bring rain, turn the heart of a lover, speak truth in a dying country, undo the reign of a dictator, or what in the poem gave it that kind of power. We did not know how poetry lived in our tribal communities, often sung, or in the language of speeches and speaking, doing the hard work of ritual. We could have been taught to listen. I imagine being in an elementary or middle school classroom and hearing the teacher urging us to listen with your ears, listen with your eyes, your throat, your abdomen, your toes. I'm right there. We can listen with everything. Imagine listening with your belly to the cricket on the stairs, the raven at the door. Then let's discuss the historic period of the poem, because that can be really interesting. The kind of language and how it evolved and why and what was going on culturally. We will view the images of land and plants. Then we will go back and listen again. We can listen in the way we would listen to a song for ear pleasure. The gates of poetry would open wide, and we'd have something we absolutely needed for our pre-adolescent lives, in which we'd see a president shot live on television, watch bloody skirmishes in Vietnam, the protests for racial justice, or the emergence of so-called free love. And never did we see Indigenous people in any kind of written or media story. Instead, we only appeared in the story field as hunted by the US cavalry, romanticized as speakers of short syllabic words of simple truths, or inspirers of fashion in the head beats and bandanas of hippies. We were not poets. Instead, in those years back then, we'd labor through poetry, when poetry had many gifts to share, and then to the next unit of study, even worse, to sentence diagramming. So the poem that opens up in American Sunrise is called Break My Heart. And it's a certain kind of poem called an ars poetica that poets write now and then. I started way back with the poet Horace, and it's a poem about how to write a poem. Break my heart. And I think about what it means to write a poem, and what, for me, I want to go beyond what I know, beyond the ordinary. For me, I go to the language of poetry. I think of poetry as a sacred language, to get into those places that everyday language can't always get to. Break my heart. There are always flowers, love cries, or blood. Someone is always leaving by exile, death, or heartbreak. The heart is a fist. It pockets prayer or holds rage. It's a timekeeper, music maker, or backstreet truth teller. Baby, 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 you can't say what's been said before, even though words are creatures of habit. You cannot force poetry with a ruler or jail it at a desk. Mystery is blind, but wills you to untie the cloth in eternity. Police with their guns cannot enter here to move us off our lands. History will always find you and wrap you in its 1,000 arms. Someone will lift from the earth without wings. Another will fall from the sky through knots of a tree. Chaos is primordial. All words have roots here. You will never sleep again, though you will never stop dreaming. The end can only follow the beginning, and it will zigzag through time, governments, and lovers. Be who you are, even if it kills you, and it will, over and over again, even as you live. Break my heart, why don't you? That's what I want a poem to do, or to go into the broken places and help me find a way through. And in doing that, it's important to help others also find the way through. I'm going to read this poem from An American Sunrise called Honoring, page Honoring. And I keep thinking, this poem, I could have doubled the length of this poem or quadrupled it. I came to this because I think, that's one of the functions of poetry, period, is honoring. It's like honoring a moment, honoring a moment that might go unnoticed, but has so much meaning. Maybe a certain flower that's by itself, a plant that's by itself. I don't know if you think about that, but I'm driving somewhere, and like between here and Albuquerque, and there's this flat plains of Texas, and you'll see a tree out there all by itself, and it's so flat, and for miles there aren't any more trees like that. And I always wonder if that tree is lonely, or what it's thinking about. Then I go to poetry, And this poem came about, I think about when I get new clothes or get something, I look to see where it's made. And I like to, when I'm being conscious and not, not plugged into that chattering mindset of internet, but I'm glad we have internet tonight, of internet and phone jangle and all that stuff that keeps us from diving deep. I like to say thank you to the people who made these clothes. My daughter made these earrings, and I think of her sitting over, with all her beads lined up and what she's thinking about. She also did this cover here of Poet Warrior. That's her beadwork of the water spider, who is carrying a fire ember on her back to help us. So this poem came out of thinking of that, honoring, or how when I lived in Hawaii for 11 years, I learned that there are not just one kind of banana, there's all kinds of bananas. And there was a story there. Why? Where did they come from? I was growing bananas in the yard, but I was thinking about how the bananas get to our table and who carried them. Did anybody sing to the plants? It makes a difference. Honoring. Who sings to the plants that are grown for our plates? Are they gathered lovingly in aprons or arms? Or do they suffer the fate of the monster reaper? No song at all, only the sound of money being stacked in a bank. Who stitched the seams in my clothes, one line after another? Was the room sweaty and dark with no hour to spare? Did she have enough to eat? Did she have a home anywhere? Or did she live on the floor? And where were the children? Or was the seamstress, the child with no home of his or her own, who sacrifices to make clothes for strangers of another country? And why? Let's remember to thank the grower of food, the picker, the driver, the sun and the rain. Let's remember to thank each maker of stitch and layer of pattern, the dyer of color. In the immense house of beauty and pain, let's honor the maker. Let's honor what's made. Even the maker of ourselves, all of us here right now together. Gratitude. So every poem has ancestors. Every poet. I mean, we all have a genealogy of family lines coming from grandparents and so on. But there are also lines of connection or relativity between poets. And so one of the poets who really caught my ear, and her voice was one of the first voices personally to speak to me from a poem. Like she was sitting there, I'm sitting there reading with the book up and my knees up, and I could see her on the other side of my knees. Also, I could see her as a young woman trying to figure out this story we were in and how we fit in and what does it mean and who are we. So that's why I included Emily Dickinson's I'm Nobody, Who Are You? And I also thought it was important because there's so much of an American Sunrise is about history, and poets research. Every poet I know researches. Now, it may not be totally apparent, but poets are really truth tellers. So it's important to know past, present, and we often get a glimpse of future. It just comes out through the poems. And when I heard this poem as a young woman, I could hear the voice stirred me. Emily Dickinson, I'm nobody, who are you? I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, How dreary to be somebody, how lonely like a frog, how public like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. Then I add this little note. Emily Dickinson was 6 years old when Manawi and his family began the immigration west. Well, the immigration west wasn't by a choice. We were illegally moved from our lands in the southeast, and a lot of tribal nations in the east were moved west. So she was 6 years old when that happened. So that gives me a way to place this voice in the story. It's interesting. It opens up a door to history there. So I think I'm going to read another poem. This one is called, because I consider her a mentor. She's a poetry ancestor, Emily Dickinson. There are other poetry ancestors. I speak about them in my memoir, Poet Warrior, like in Scott Momaday. Audre Lorde was another poetry. She's a poetry mentor, teacher. Meredith Lesueur. One of my poetry mentors was Adrienne Rich. And I met her not far from Attleboro. She was living for a time in Hadley, Massachusetts, not too far away from you. And I'm thinking about, I was staying somewhere not too far one night in a hotel room after doing some kind of performance. And I was sitting there and I started writing this poem on longhand. I often write longhand and then put it I like putting it up and then working with it that way on the screen. But again, I was thinking, by the way, it's important to honor those who have been there before us. There's one fiction writer. She had married, what is her last name? Anyway, that was one of her assignments. She had her students write a letter to somebody who inspired them. But this was for Adrienne Rich, by the way. You know, you miss people when they go. And so sometimes if it's a poet, you can talk to them in poems. And it's by the way, for Adrienne Rich. I've given it time as if time were mine to give. There was a dam larger than Hoover or the president or the patent for the metal creature that sucks up all the dust. Words had to stop and ask permission before crossing over. Oh, sometimes they were wild with the urgency of sweet and leaped. Mostly the rest were kept in the net of swallowed or forbidden language. I want to go back and rewrite all the letters. I lied frequently. No, I was not okay. And neither was James Baldwin, though his essays were perfect spinning platters of comprehension of the fight to assert humanness in a black and white world. That's how the blues emerged, by the way. Our spirits needed a way to dance through the heavy mess. The music, a sack that carries the bones of those left alongside the trail of tears when we were forced to leave everything we knew, by the way. I constructed an individual life in the so-called civilized world. We all did, far from the trees and plants who had borne us and fed us. All I wanted was the music I would tell you now, within it, what we cannot carry. I talk about then from a hotel room just miles from your home in the East, before you fled on your personal path of tears. To the West, that worn-out American dream dogging your steps. You lived on a pedestal for me then, the driven diver who climbed back up from the abyss, Venus on a seashell with a dagger in her hands. I had to look and followed your tracks in the poems cut by suffering. Aren't they all? We're in the apocalyptic age of addiction and forgetting. It's worse now. But that dam, I had to tell you. I broke it open stone by stone. It took a saxophone, flowers, and your words had something to do with it. I can't say exactly how. The trajectory wasn't clean, even though it was sure. Does that make sense? Maybe it does only in the precincts of dreams and poetry, not in a country lit for 24 hours a day to keep dreams stuck turning in a wheel in the houses of money. I read about transcendence, how the light came in through the window of a nearby traveler, and to every cell of creation opened its mouth to drink grace. That's what I never told you. So I've woven history through everything, even if it's not apparent. I mean, there's history woven through there. I mean, it is through everything anyway. Let's see. This one is, okay, this is a love poem. So sometimes when I've taught in middle schools or come in with elementary schools and I'm doing poetry, sometimes I remember one time I went into a class and there was a blackboard all the way around and I got chalk out and I said, okay, let's write all the words. Uh-oh, my computer's about to go out. Hang on. Oh my goodness. Oh shoot, there. Okay, good. I didn't realize that
You were scaring me, Joy.
yeah, I looked up and I had this message, your Mac will go to sleep. Sorry about that. Your Mac, yeah, it's about ready to go to sleep and I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm okay. So anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, so I had them write. We filled up the whole classroom, the whole blackboard with poems, words used in love poems. So then I told them, you have to write a love poem, but you can't use any of these words. And man, they thought it was impossible. But of course, they wound up finding even more words that are in love poems. And so this is a love poem. I came to realize it's a love poem, but it's also a poem about history and how people make it through, that we make it through as human beings. When I was coming up as a young artist, I remember thinking, what is my intention in this life? What is it I want to do is what I am doing. And of course, one is to explore and see how far I can go with the art of images or the art of language. And the other thing was I want Native people to be seen as human beings. And so this, yes, there were trails of tears and they were walked by human beings and we're everything from saxophone players like me and then my grandmother Naomi Harjo, and we were astronauts and we're human beings and we write love poems. And I had a grandfather, I had a great uncle, probably about 4 or 5 grades, who, and people don't know these stories, who had the largest horse racing establishment on the Eastern Seaboard and Muscogee Creek. People don't hear those stories. And so the Trail of Tears moved everybody. It's because somebody wanted that racing track. And so they just came at gunpoint and moved us out of our homes and our business establishments and so on. Anyway, this poem came when my husband and I took a position at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I love those people. And we went all over our homelands down there. And so this is sort of about from there and thinking about the Trail of Tears and about how, about endurance and love. My man's feet. And when I read this at a reading and he's there, everybody wants to come and look at his feet. My man's feet. They are heroic roots. You cannot mistake them for any other 6-foot walker. I could find them in a sea of feet, a planet or universe of feet. They kicked the sky at birth in that town his great-grandfather found. My man's feet left childhood, past the mineral grit of an oil flush bust to these atomic eastbound lands. His feet are made of his mother's spiritual concern and of his father, historic and mindfully upright. What walkers, from mound builder's steps that led to the skymaker, past Spanish galleon, stagecoach, and railroad snaker. One generation following another, No other feet but these could bear the rock-stubborn, loyal bear, towering intelligence and children picker-upper. That is the one who owns these feet. What an anchor his feet provide for his unmatched invincibility and get-up-again-ality. I dance behind this man in the stomp dance circle, our feet beating rhythm together, man, woman, boy, girl, sun and moon jumper. My man's feet are the sure steps of a father looking after his sons, his daughters. For when he laughs, he opens all the doors of our hearts, even as he forgets to shut them when he leaves. And when he grieves for those he loves, he carves out valleys enough to hold everyone's tears with his feet, these feet. My man's widely humble, ever steady, beautiful, brown feet. Some people might say that these things don't, this poem doesn't rhyme. The rhyme isn't at the end, always at the end of the lines. It's built in like father, daughters, hearts, and then leaves, loves, grieves, tears is kind of takes off in that. So it's all wound in, it's woven in so that it's like looking at a pattern of a rug instead of having a design like at the end, like you would have for a poem, a verse that would rhyme at the end. The rhymes come like here, they make a pattern inside. So I'm going to play something. So I'm also a musician. I started learning when I was about 40, but I take saxophone. But I take the poems, some of the poems I write as songs, and some of them I turn into songs, or I make music around spoken poetry. So because this book is an American Sunrise, and this is the poem that started the whole album, my new album, I Pray for My Enemies, I'm going to play this. I won't play all the sax solo at the end, but just so you can hear a poem in a different way. Here we go. And this features Rich Robinson on guitar, on blazing guitar. And yeah, Rich Robinson. Okay. Well, it is supposed to go.
We were running out of breath as we ran to meet ourselves. We were surfacing the edge of our ancestors' fights and ready to strike. It was difficult to lose days in the Indian bar if you were straight. Easy if you played pool and drank to remember and to forget. We made plans to be professional, and some of us could sing. We drove to the edge of the mountains with a drum. We made sense of our beautiful crazed lives under the starry stars. We learned the devil from the Christians. We sang. We were the heathens, but needed to be saved from them. Thin chance. We knew we were all related in this story. The little gin will clarify the dark and make us all feel like dancing. Make us feel like dancing. Make us feel like dancing. Viva, 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 We had something to do with the origins of blues and jazz. I argued with the music as I filled the jukebox with dimes in June. 40 years later, and we still want justice. 40 years later, and we still want justice. We are still America. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho.
Okay, that was most of An American Sunrise. I cut off some of the solo. We need to leave some time for questions, and let's see, I want to close the reading part or the speaking part here. I was going to read Washing My Mother's Body, but that's a little long. Instead, I think that I've wondered about what humans, I guess I'll end with this. I've wondered about what use humans are in this world. And I look at this beautiful earth and you know, now we have oceans with islands of trash, and we're all dealing with what we have done to this place. And this place that gives us so much, gives us everything. And I was thinking, well, what do humans, what do we do? And what are we here for? And I was thinking, well, we're story gatherers. There's something in that. We're gathering the story together. You know, and we have a part. I mean, we're part of the story of our families, our own story that we're making as we go out in our lives, our family story. There's a story of our communities, whether it's a tribal nation, a rural community, a city, other kinds of associations. And then there's the story we make of a country, of a planet, the planetary story, because when you look at the Earth from the moon, we're one person. And a galactic story, and we make stories. And I learned that early on, I guess, with my, you know, we go out, we go out and we text now, call up people, you know, call on the phone. Now we go on the internet, social media, not the best source of stories necessarily, but that's what we do. And I think, okay, then maybe we are to help with the story of Earth, obviously. So I wanted to end with this little piece about my mother and story gathering, and the poem Perhaps the World Ends Here. My mother was a talker. Everyone knew my mother. She was friendly and moved about the earth collecting stories with a natural curiosity. She loved words, especially the way they could move with music. My mother had an 8th grade education, which gave her a great insecurity about words. Yet in her songwriting, and as in the poetry she loved, words would grow wings. They could fly. My mother made friends wherever she went in the neighborhood, the market, the local bar where she was the shuffleboard queen, or the beauty shop. She was a good-looking woman, and men at every age were attractive. Women were her best friends. My mother was the one who kept the party going, and she was one of the best bakers, so these gatherings usually happened in our kitchen. She kept the kitchen spotless. Everything shined. Even the sunlight preferred my mother's kitchen over all the others in the kingdom of kitchens. The sun entered happily through the windows, clean with vinegar, framed by large green leaf plants. When my mother and her girlfriends started getting serious with their talk, I was shooed out of the kitchen. I hid. I perfected the art of disappearance. I'd appear to leave, then slide quietly beneath the kitchen table. I can still feel the curve of the table legs, how they met in the middle and branched out, made a circle into which I fit perfectly, beneath the ebb and flow of women talk. My ears were bent for stories, for the forbidden, the mystery pieces. It was there I heard he was pregnant, found out the neighbor was a bootlegger, and knew my best friend was moving even before she did. A story could destroy someone's life or make someone else a hero. This story circle was a powerful place. My mother would share, of course, but never for pity. She was positive and never complained, no matter how difficult her struggle. My father had hit on most of these women, but if any of them had succumbed, they were not in the circle. My mother could smell them out. Her sense of knowing was honed to a blade of difficult truth. Because of that, of course, she knew I was under the table. She understood it, as she too was the consummate story gatherer, and I was, after all, my mother's daughter. Perhaps the world ends here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us and at our poor falling down selves as we put ourselves back together once again at the kitchen table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table, while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. So thank you, and I guess we're open for questions.
Thank you, Joy, so much. This is Kim in the ether.
Yeah, I know your voice out in the ether.
So we have a question from Sarah. What other Native American poets and or authors would you recommend to your readers?
There are so many. There was something called the Native American Renaissance, literary Renaissance, that I'm included in, with Scott Momaday and Leslie Soko and many others. But there's been another wave of Native poets that include Layli Long Soldier, Natalie Diaz, Jennifer Forrester. Oh, there's so many of them. Sherwin Bitsui, a whole wave of young Native poets that have actually done. Natalie Diaz garnered a Pulitzer Prize recently, young poet, for her poetry. Layli Long Soldier was a finalist for the National Book Award for Poetry. And you can find many of them on the Poet Laureate site of contemporary, the map. I have a digital map that includes contemporary Native poets. Not all of them, just a fraction, so many of them. And there's a book, Living Nations, Living Words, has some of those poems, includes some of those poems and poets.
Great, thank you. This is a question from Diana, and she says, in what ways does connecting to your ancestors help you deal with the pandemic?
Yeah, we're all connected, and then I preface that, well, with some ancestors you don't want to be connected with. So some were troublemakers, and they're still troublemakers, and but I think poetry connects you with those important, crucial parts of yourself, and I think during this pandemic that we've all come to see how crucial, the tool that poetry is, how useful poetry is in a time when right now there's been so much upheaval going on in so many parts of our lives. Excuse me. Water. Thank you. So, so much upheaval. I mean, a pandemic, we've never seen anything like this. You could step outside of your door and die of COVID. Then the climate change that we were watching, it shifts us out of, our expectations change. We can't count on anything. Our home, is, I keep thinking of those Haitian people under the bridge and thinking about uncertainty and needing a home. And we're haunted by so much these days. It's so different now too, when we're inundated with stories and heartbreak from every corner of the world. I mean, how do we process that? And then what goes on even in our own families, the heartbreak and the stories everybody has, that goes on in the families, and then we see that it's like this morning I went on Facebook. I haven't been on it very much lately. I'm trying to stay away. And the first story was of a community member who's saying, I don't usually reach out and I'm in a lot of pain. A young man who's already lost his legs to diabetes at 40. I mean, we're inundated with these yet we're all kind of this one being. And so for me, poetry becomes a way, writing it, thinking it, and being in that space, which is an ancestor. I mean, that's how how do you speak with your ancestors? Well, ancestors are evident in the children, and but those ancestor voices, they're there. We go back and find them, for instance, Emily Dickinson or Adrienne Rich, or I think of some of poets that I go to, like in Scott Momaday. He's still here, but I go back to those people who they help me stop and listen and breathe, breathe deep and realize, well, we've been through this before. We can make it through. We may not know what's coming, but we can make it through this moment. We can listen to these words. We can help each other.
Great. So I have a question from Kathy. I love this question. What do you consider the greatest gift of being a Native American, a blessing many of us do not have?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think what it is feeling that the rootedness, and that having that story link that connect directly to the lands that we're on. I think that's part of it. And I think people get lonely for that, even though people have settled here and made homes and have grown roots and have stories. We all have stories, and all of our stories have worth. But I think that's the part of it, is feeling a kind of rootedness that, but it doesn't make, all the stories matter, and all of them have their place.
And Chris would like to know, what is the significance of your hand art?
Our people tattooed extensively. In fact, my great-grandfather, the one Manawi who fought Andrew Jackson, who's featured in An American Sunrise, he had face tattoos, and women and men tattooed. Usually the tattoos had to do with specific, of course, life events. And so it kind of comes out of that, but I didn't get this in. I don't think there's anyone. I don't know that there's any. I know some people get more of those more traditional Muscogee tattoos, but I lived for a long time in Hawaii, and then was friends with Keone Nunez. I am still friends with him, who helped bring back Hawaiian and Polynesian tattoo art. He's been a major force for that. And so I have some of his tattoos, which are similar. The designs are very similar to Muscogee designs. And the hand tattoo I got from one of his friends, Ro'onui in Tahiti. And I told him why I wanted it. It has to do with, what I do with my hands, writing, playing saxophone. And I see it as kind of inking memory and inking stories, and as kind of it reminds me, and then it's art. I mean, there's a definite art to this tattoo.
So Joyce is watching on Facebook, and she would like to know, where can we find Joy's recordings?
They're on Magic City Books is selling my CDs here in Tulsa. I'm trying not to. I'm so busy trying to fill orders, but you could write for the music, Joy Harjo PL, capital P, capital L, at gmail.com. Or but yeah, you can find them there. My music is on all of the digital platforms. Spotify, which pays artists just fractions of pennies for their work. iTunes, Amazon, all of those places have my music. My most recent album, I Pray for My Enemies, and then the other albums can all be found on those digital platforms.
Great. I will close out with, this is always the hardest question I'm ever asked, is if you could choose your favorite book, what would it be?
That is a hard one. I have a hard time when people ask me what I'm writing. And a friend asked me today, but because I didn't feel on the spot, I was telling her all kinds of things. My favorite, with one book, what would it be? Now I don't know that I can answer that.
We could say top 3.
I know what album I would have. I know I would have A Love Supreme by John Coltrane and Sketches of Spain by Miles Davis.
Oh, I like those. Music is easier than books.
Yeah, I like that anthology of native poetry we did, When the Light of the World Was Subdued. Our songs came through. Probably that Louis Untermeyer collection, that my childhood book of poetry. It would be hard to pick out just one. I think of Audre Lorde's Our Dead Behind Us. I don't know, it'd be hard. Yeah.
All right. Well, I will jump on screen and just thank you so much, Joy, on behalf of the Attleboro Public Library and An Unlikely Story. That was just a very blessed hour to spend with you. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for inviting me into your homes and offices and your community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everybody.